What if I told you that in One Piece there's a secret society that has been guiding Luffy's journey to become Joy Boy and save the world? And what if I told you that this group is literally hundreds of years old? But the craziest thing is that we've actually met many of these characters who have paved the way for Luffy and many of the other Straw Hats to bring down the world government already. And well, in this video, I want to break down with you exactly who I think that these characters are and how they have been shaping the world for centuries. These are the Bragmen. Because maybe you can relate to this, but I've been thinking a lot about this legendary book of tales lately, and I really wanted to break down why exactly it has suddenly become so important to the manga, and my investigation took me way back in One Piece history. I'm talking about hidden clues regarding Noland the Explorer, the Scholars of Ohara, and yes, even the ancient Iron Giant Emeth, which all led to a really startling conclusion in the end. But before I get to my first really important figure here in this journey on how this all fits together and makes sense, let me first quickly set the stage here, because even though we don't exactly know how the world was after the Void Century, there are some pretty strong speculations that we can all make at this point. First, we do know that the Ancient Kingdom, which existed before the Void Century already, was insanely technologically advanced. But then, after the Void Century, all of that technology apparently vanished just like this. Secondly, we do know that the world government is the party that now rules the world. And third, we do know that a group known as the D-Clan has survived throughout the Void Century, and they are also known as the enemy of the gods. And that's already pretty much basically all that we know at this point. What's even crazier though is that we know even less somehow about the 400 years following the events of the Void Century. Seriously, so far pretty much nothing happens that we know about, and we can imagine that the world was still recovering from this ancient giant war, but this time period is almost guaranteed to have suffered under the rule of the world government's oppression just the same, which is most likely why almost no history of it exists as well. But of course, all of that changes when we hit 400 years before the current storyline, and this is the time period of our first major character in the secret society preparing the world for Joy Boy's return. A secret society that I'm just gonna refer to as the Bragmen, since that is the title of the book written by many explorers that has become so important at the start of the new Elbaf arc in the manga. Because let me reintroduce you guys to Mont Blanc Noland. Now, just a quick recap here in case you've forgotten. Noland was one of the main characters in the flashback in Skypiea, where we learned that 400 years ago, he was a botanist and explorer who discovered the kingdom of Shandora. Now, I hope that we all remember just how incredible this flashback was, with tragedy, friendship, and the theme of challenging the gods, but especially now that we've been looking back over all these years, we've kind of all figured out collectively that the Skypiea arc truly has foreshadowed so much of the future big lore events of the story. I'm talking about taking down a false god, finding a mythical lost city, and of course, the foreshadowing of Joy Boy and even Nika, which is just by itself already mind-blowing to say the least, but for the purpose of this video and to discover the secrets of Bragman, we're gonna pay special attention to Noland and his life as an explorer. And there are actually a few clues here that I'm gonna use to explain why his life is so important, but I'll start with one major bomb by saying that Noland might have been the Joy Boy of his time. That's right, kind of a crazy statement here, but let me explain what I mean by that. But first, I also want to talk about protecting yourself on the high seas of the internet, because with all of the sketchy websites and trackers out there, online safety is something that everyone should be taking seriously. And that's where Cyberghost VPN comes in, the sponsor of today's video. Now, if you're not familiar, Cyberghost VPN creates a secure tunnel for all of your internet traffic, hiding your IP address and keeping your own data encrypted. It's kind of like your own personal log post guiding you through the internet safely. You can even switch your location in just 3 clicks, giving you access to geo-restricted content from places like Netflix, Hulu, and so many more. I use it for Crunchyroll. It's a real game changer, especially if you want to catch up on shows or grab better online deals from different regions. Cyberghost VPN works on pretty much everything: Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, even smart TVs and consoles, and one subscription covers up to 7 devices, so you can protect your entire crew. Plus, they've got this really amazing deal for my subscribers, just $2.03 a month plus 4 months for free, which is 84% off. It's seriously a steal. There's a 45-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support, so you're covered if you ever change your mind. So if you're interested, go join over 38 million users who trust Cyberghost VPN to keep their browsing secure. The link's in the description and the pinned comment. Protect yourself today risk-free. You see, above all else, Joy Boy and Nika do represent freedom and friendship, and that's pretty much exactly what Noland represents all throughout his flashback and beyond that even. He of course saves the entire race of Shandians from a deadly disease and then becomes great friends with them as well. But what's even more important is that he changed their entire way of thinking. They kind of went from worshipping gods who weren't ever going to help them in the first place to truly embracing a new way of living. And actually, this idea in particular is going to be super important for this video, so I'm going to repeat it once again. An explorer becomes friends with the suffering people, an explorer saved them with the help of friendship and science, and then liberated them from the oppression of the old gods. Now, if that idea sounds familiar to you, that's probably because it is basically the entire story so far of Luffy's journey. He travels and explores, makes friends, and then saves them from their oppression. And you can even look at that from a small arc-by-arc scale, or blow it up to represent the entire journey to find the One Piece altogether. And of course, we also know at this point that the Shandians weren't even the only ones that Noland befriended, as we also know that he was known as the great friend and savior of the Tontada tribe of dwarves who lived next to Dressrosa. And so I think it's pretty obvious that Noland was quite well traveled and likely explored much of the world, both the Grand Line and the New World, before his very unfortunate death. But what's maybe even crazier, I think, is that Noland's death also has connections to yet another Joy Boy-like character. Because you see, at the end of the Skypiea flashback, Noland is sentenced to be executed for lying to his king, which we'll also talk more about the importance of lies in just a moment. But what's important here about this scene for us today is that Noland's execution is very strikingly similar, of course, to that of the former Pirate King, Goldie Roger, way back at the very start of the story. Literally. So yeah, it isn't really a stretch at all, I think, to call Noland a Joy Boy-like character, even if he clearly probably never had the exact devil fruit powers to go along with it. But you might now be wondering, okay, yeah, we do know Noland is important and all of that, but what does that have to do at all with the Bragman and Luffy saving the world? Like, how are these two things even remotely connected, Manu? Well, I'm glad that you asked, because you do have to remember the state that the world is in at this point in history. In Noland's time, the world is broken, disconnected, technology and science have been completely lost, and most importantly, this is exactly how the world government wanted the world to be after they took over. And no one was ever going to be able to challenge them right at the start. I mean, the world was way too weak and didn't even know that they needed to be fighting in the first place. And that is exactly where people like Noland come in. You see, just by the simple fact of exploring the world, making friends and connections with other people, and of course advancing science through his own studies, Noland is just actively fighting against the world government directly, whether on purpose or not. He's fighting against the disconnected world that they set up, and he is bringing the world one step closer to how it was before the Void Century as well, because that is how large-scale changes are made all throughout history. In fact, even real-world history. I mean, progress is usually made in small steps, small leaps of progress of years and years, until finally the world is ready for a huge amount of change in a really small amount of time. And so I'd say that without Noland and other explorers like him traveling the One Piece world, I can basically guarantee you that we don't ever get a great age of piracy that Luffy is thriving in today. Now, let me just say that Oda is basically telling us all that this is very important because he wrote Noland's lasting legacy to be that of a liar, because as we've seen throughout the story, the people in power will always lie to hide the actual truth. Noland was put to death for being called a liar, even though he was right all along. The world government hid Roger's true name to hide information about the D-Clan, since the D's are always painted as the enemies of the Celestial Dragons and the gods. In fact, in the One Piece world, Luffy has had just so many lies told about him and his actions that most of the world at this point just thinks that he's a straight up villain, even though he's of course the exact opposite of that. Which now brings me again back to the idea of Bragman. As I'm going to be discussing with you later on, Bragman is a book of tall tales. It is commonly considered a book full of lies, but as we just discussed, that most likely just means it contains more truth than the world government would ever want you to know. But we'll get to that point in just a moment. We're getting a little bit too ahead of ourselves here, and as we finish the chapter of Noland here, I think it's fair to say that without this person, the world would have definitely taken a lot longer to reach the point where they're ready for Joy Boy's return than they otherwise would have. But what I bet you're wondering at this point is how in the world Noland's stories should be leading to a hidden society secretly fighting the world government all this time, because we of course never got any evidence of Noland being, part of any such group. As far as we know, he's not even AD, at least so far as we know of. But Noland's story is really just a start here, and everything about his legacy makes the next major chapter of this video just so important to talk about. So now I'm gonna take you and go jump ahead in time quite a little bit here and talk about a mind-blowing character who was actually introduced in the Ekhet Island arc, because one of the most confusing mysteries introduced during this arc was the history of the ancient giant robot, Emeth. And I'm not even talking about any of the crazy stuff that he did in that arc, like the crazy hockey knot he got from Joy Boy, but instead I want to talk about Emeth's previous awakening, which happened over 200 years ago, and his mysterious mission to try and destroy Merijoa. Now, what I want to be clear about here though is that there is very little that is actually said about that event in the manga. So instead, we'll be looking at what isn't said, because at this point, here is what we actually do know about Emeth and his attack on the Holy Lands. First of all, we do know that this occurred roughly 200 years before the current story, which oddly is pretty much exactly half of the time since Noland was alive. And basically, Emeth arrived out of nowhere and then attacked Merijoa, trying to complete some sort of ancient important mission. Now, we also know that the world government ordered their scientists to actually destroy the robot, but lucky for us, Saint Saturn here decided to keep the robot secret and study it instead. Which of course is then how it remained until Vegapunk started studying the ancient machine himself. Now, besides just that, we also know that Emeth seems to be powered by Luffy's awakened Nika form. In particular, it seems to be the Drums of Liberation's heartbeat that powers this machine and brings him back to life in the first place on Ekhet. And we do know that this isn't just some random fluke either, because yet another ancient creature right here also recognized the Drums of Liberation and instantly went, Joy Boy, which, isn't bad, but that's basically it. So you might now be wondering why I'm bringing it up in connection to the Bragman out of all people and all the explorers who rode it together out in the world. But here's what you have to consider, I think. Before Emeth showed up 200 years ago, this massive giant robot and former crewmate slash nakama of Joy Boy had to have been hidden somewhere in the One Piece world where the government couldn't get to it. Now, we don't know where, but somehow someone most likely found the robot and then got it to start working for them. Most likely, I would argue, some kind of explorer, if you ask me, but we of course don't know that for sure. Now, obviously, this wasn't the world government since Emeth went and attacked them, so we're just gonna have to ask who found it, and more importantly, how did they in the world get the ancient giant to work again? Well, the truth here, of course, is that we don't really know, but that of course won't stop me from speculating based on all the information that we already have, because just thinking about this logically for a second, if you stay with me here, we do know that Emeth is powered by the Drums of Liberation, which these days does seem to only be possible with Luffy's Gear 5th Awakening, but we've also been told that no one has apparently awakened Luffy's Devil Fruit power in centuries, probably since the Void Century. So either there is some alternate power source that we're missing here, like I guess the ancient original version of the Mother Flame, or the Gorosei just didn't know that there was actually someone else who already awakened Luffy's Devil Fruit in the past. And now, trust me, I do know it sounds a little bit unlikely that someone just randomly found this robot and then also managed to find and awaken Luffy's Nika Fruit. I mean, low possibility there for sure, but at the same time, it honestly kind of seems like the only plausible and likely answer at this point to me. Again, unless Emeth just had some random power surge or someone really did find a way to recreate the energy technology of the Ancient Kingdom 200 years before Vegapunk, but again, that does seem almost more unlikely to me. So while we don't really have a good answer for it yet, all of this really boils down to one single idea in my opinion. 200 years ago, some explorers found Emeth and discovered a way to wake him up. Again, we don't know who, we don't know where, but it was someone, and the best possible answer is an explorer who knew something about the Ancient Kingdom and how this technology operates. Which is exactly why I do think that they might actually represent a group of explorers who have been searching for the truth about the Void Century and the history of the world all this time. And yeah, it could even be tied to the almost extinct Buccaneer race, since they are so closely tied to Nika and the Drums of Liberation for all we know. Whatever the case may be though, while waking up Emeth clearly did not end up bringing down the world government back back in that time, it does seem like an important clue that someone was actively searching for a way to try and take down the government anyways. Now, interestingly enough, we also have this very strange ship that fell from the sky back in chapter 219. Do you remember this? And what really caught my eye about this is that this was from a very similar time period as when Emeth apparently attacked Marijua 200 years ago, exactly 202 years in the past. And we do know from Oda that this ship, which is called the Saint Briss or Saint Bliss, depending what translation you read, was actually found guilty of some sort of crime up in Skypiea and then got sentenced to go drift up on clouds, starving until they then at some point 200 years later fell off back to sea. So I don't have any real proof that these two are exactly connected, but it was just a really interesting thing to note that the time frames here do line up. In fact, those two events with Emeth awakening and the Saint Briss are literally two of the only things that we do know about this time period at all in the story altogether. And so maybe Emeth was actually up in the sky and some explorers found him and powered him up. We do know that the Shandian race were allies of Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom, so that would make them a decent candidate to hide a giant powerful robot. Plus, again, remember that Skypiea was just overall such an important arc that it would make absolute sense to me that it was hiding more secrets from the past as well. And while it's kind of frustrating that we still don't know that much about this point in history, at this point, luckily, we finally get to the real juicy, meatiest part of this mystery secret society, because now we're truly getting closer to the modern era, and there has been just so much going on in the last century to make the world ready to find the One Piece treasure and bring freedom to the world finally. And there's of course one group in particular that has done more for this course than literally anyone else, and we're talking of course about the scholars of the Library of Ohara. Oh, not me? Alright, okay, sorry. Okay. And let me just tell you that with this group, things get really interesting because the connections are just flying absolutely off the charts. It's kind of the opposite from what we've been talking about so far. Like, that was just a warm-up, because as we recently learned during the Egghead Island arc, the scholars of Ohara were not just the library-loving bookworms that we originally thought them to be. No, in fact, they were some of the most daring explorers out on the One Piece oceans ever. And it all kind of started with their fearless leader, Cloudy Clover. And I still love that name. Absolutely, like Cloudy, like cloudy, just gets me every time. Pretty cool. But how are Clover and the scholars of Ohara actually connected to these like mysterious explorers of the past? Well, first up, it's pretty obvious to me at this point that they were themselves explorers, just like Noland, and in fact, they're basically also pirates just like Luffy, sailing the world, searching for answers, escaping from the world government time and time again, and that is basically the story of Professor Clover as we learned it in chapter 1120, I think it was. Because here we do see the true origins of Clover's ambition to learn the true history. You see, as a member of the famed D-Clan, Clover and his brother were actually caught by the world government, and his brother ended up being executed. And from that moment onwards, Clover was determined to learn what really happened in the past. But this scene was not actually the start of Clover's adventure here. Now, we do know that by this point, he had already been traveling the world for literal years searching for the truth. I mean, we can even see him here, and how can you tell me that this man is not an explorer, right? I mean, he is 100%, no doubt about it. And so here is where the possibility of a secret society finally really starts taking a hold, because we do know that Clover traveled the world searching for clues, and we don't know exactly how long he was actually doing this for, but it sure does seem like this was his entire life's work. So I would guess that he was doing this for at least, we're gonna say like 20 or 30 years before the burning of Ohara even happens. And all of that work and all of that exploring got him closer to the secrets than anyone else. They found a poneglyph and cracked the secrets of its forbidden language, but I've just always wondered just how they actually learned to read the poneglyphs to begin with. I mean, it's basically impossible to decipher a language without some sort of translated pieces to compare it to. So how did those scholars here do it? And unless they kind of went to Wano, befriended the Shogun, and then found out that the Shoguns had passed down that knowledge amongst themselves, it would make a lot of sense, I think, if they were actually others in the past before them who knew the language and wrote it down, or just possibly wrote down translations. Now, of course, we don't know that for sure, but it would certainly help explain that one major mystery in particular. Now, I do say all of this trying to connect Clover to these explorers of the past, but in reality, it doesn't even matter if he was officially part of a literal secret society or not, because he did end up carrying on the will of these explorers of the past anyways. As you know, as a One Piece fan, inherited will is one of the biggest themes of the entire story and is mentioned countless times throughout it, which actually makes Clover's role the perfect example of yet another explorer taking up the role of making the world a better place through connecting the world, advancing science, and bringing the world closer to how it was in the past, and paving the way for the next Joy Boy to uncover the truth as well. Because these are the major accomplishments of the explorers, and you can certainly see how Clover fits into all of this perfectly because of all the work that then led to Robin's ability to read the poneglyphs, which is obviously a key part of Luffy's journey to find the One Piece. And I mean, it would basically be impossible for Luffy to find the One Piece and uncover the true history otherwise, if we're being honest. Like, Luffy is the payoff, but he would never have gotten there without all of these people. And so it's really just because of the contributions of Clover and his scholars, including Robin's mother Olbia, that the Straw Hats can truly sail the seas, discover the poneglyphs, and take those final steps to finding the truth. And I think that this is the true role of people like Noland and Clover, because they obviously aren't the most famous ones or the ones fighting on the front lines directly, but without them, Luffy's adventure wouldn't have been possible to begin with, if we're being honest. And we can pretty much say the same for anyone who has opposed the world government in the past centuries. For example, the Pirate King Goldie Roger, because have you ever wondered where he learned about the poneglyphs? Because if I had to guess, I would have absolutely said from Clover and his scholars. I mean, the timelines of Roger's final voyage certainly fits in very nicely with the time that Clover would have been adventuring as well. In fact, we can say the very same thing about Luffy's father, Monkey D. Dragon. We already knew that Dragon knew Clover, so it's absolutely possible that Clover revealed his research to Dragon as well, and that knowledge then led to Dragon to start fighting against the world government as well. So again, I really want to stress the point here that without Clover and without the explorers of the past like Noland, many of the major characters in the current fight against the world government would not have even been possible. Do you understand what I'm really trying to get at here? Like, have I made myself clear? Okay, good. Because now we're actually going to talk about a whole new group of explorers who might even be the most important one out of all of them. And these are the Bragmen, and really the key to this entire video. I know it took a while, but like, things are gonna start coming together now. And again, as I've already discussed at the beginning, the actual Bragmen is a collection of journal entries and writings from different explorers that were gathered together in one single volume. And in fact, we only know of one confirmed explorer whose name is officially in this book, and that is of course Louis Arnott, who we will also be discussing in a lot of detail and his importance in just a moment, but honestly, that's already enough for me to read between the lines and figure out exactly how important this group of explorers truly is to Oda's story. So let me just quickly break it down based on what we already know. The first time that the Bragmen ever came up in the One Piece story was actually in chapter 115, when Nami uses it to look up information about Little Garden. Now at that time, we didn't really know what this book was or how important it might be for the story, but as we can see in chapter 397, the book showed up once again among the countless others that were saved from the destruction of the library of Ohara, out of all places. And because of that, many people started wondering what this book was truly about. I mean, why is it so important that it was housed at the library of Ohara at all places? Pretty curious question for sure. In fact, one that fans even have asked Oda directly in his question corner about Bragmen and what it actually was all about. And what's crazy is that Oda actually gave a pretty serious answer that gives us a ton of really nice and important clues about the real relevance and the real role this book plays in his story. Oda basically gave us the explanation that the book here is a collection of journal entries from explorers of the past, and on top of that, the book apparently wasn't very widespread before the destruction of the library of Ohara happened. And now what's most interesting is that apparently we won't properly see the contents of the actual book in the story, but Oda did say that we will experience the book through the perspective of the Straw Hats' adventures. Okay, so wow. Okay, this is already a lot. And clearly Oda has thought a lot about this like really apparently niche detail and book here. So we're gonna do the same thing and try answering some of the really big questions here. Who were the explorers who contributed to this book? Why did it become popular and so widespread only after the destruction of Ohara? Why has the world government spread rumors that everything in this book is actually, don't worry about it, it's all a lie? And why is this book even important in the first place? And I actually want to start with that last question here. Why is this book important? Well, it's only shown up a few times throughout the story and we barely know anything about it. Now, you might already know where I'm going with this, of course, but I mean, come on. It was literally written by explorers who are the whole point of this video. Now, as we've already discussed, exploration is basically the key to everything in the One Piece world, and as we've seen with Noland, exploration is what connects people and creates bonds of friendship and ultimately freedom. Exploration advances science and medicine, and as we've seen with Professor Clover, exploration brings people closer to the true history of the world. So to have what is basically a guidebook to the Grand Line written by explorers like over centuries is just a huge step towards where we're just already today with the Straw Hats. In fact, this book could have been what guided the infamous pirate Roxy Zebek, who nearly conquered the world 40 years ago. This book could also have guided Gold Roger, who found the truth 24 years ago before the current storyline and basically set the stage himself for Luffy's adventures today. And now, I'll have to admit that this book might not have been as important as I'm making it out to be potentially, but I honestly do think that it is exactly as I'm saying it here. So keep watching because I'll be getting into all of the reasons why that is true in just a few minutes, but first, let's ask our next major question again about the Bragmen. Who were these legendary explorers? When did they even live? And you already know where I'm going with this one, but of course the only confirmed explorer from the Bragmen is Louis Arnott, whose words first appeared in a narrator box back in Little Garden. Actually, let me quickly read it for you because from his words we actually gain a lot of information about who he actually is. To its inhabitants, the island is truly a little garden. Therefore, let us call it Little Garden, the land of giants. So, let's dive into this here a little bit more because clearly by the time that Arnott arrived at Little Garden, the giants Dory and Broggy had already begun their fierce duel to death, which actually kindly enough gives us a nice time frame to work with here because we do know that the giant captain's duel began about 100 years ago, and we also know that the Bragman book was already written by the time that Ohara was destroyed 22 years ago. So that gives us a nice time frame for Arnott's adventures of between 100 and 22 years in the past. Which, I mean, to be fair, 78 years is a pretty long time span, but at least it does give us some general idea about when Arnott was actually sailing and who he might have interacted with. Because this, of course, lines up quite nicely with the time frames of both Rox's and Roger's adventures as well, so it's even possible that Arnott could have sailed with one or even both of these legendary pirate crews because you have to remember, authors will usually have a pen name to hide their true identity, so Louis Arnott might even be a character that we already know from the recent past or that might still even be alive today. However, that's not all that we know about Arnott because his writing showed up once again in chapter 1132 as the Straw Hats journeyed deeper into the island of Elbaf. And these words, which you can see right here, were pretty much the initial whole inspiration for this video. And I won't read this entire thing for you here, but from this quote, we basically learned that there is some sort of big danger or risk to staying too long in Elbaf, which is wild and prompted a whole bunch of theories all over the community about possibly being trapped in time or something like that, but I don't want to get into that entire mystery in this video here. But what it does do is bring us closer to answering one of our other key questions about the Bragmen. Why did it only become so popular after Ohara was destroyed? Well, because Oda basically told us that it is only because the book was saved from the island that it later became mass-produced and spread around around the world. And so we just kind of have to ask ourselves here, who started making copy of that book and why? I mean, honestly, I think we can answer both of these questions pretty well because we do know the main reasons any books were saved at all was because of Robin's friend, the giant Jaguar D. Saul. In fact, all saved books were then taken to Elbaf where they remain to this very day, which means that the person who decided to make copies of Bragman should be no one other than our boy Jaguar D. Saul right here anyways. So that now of course leaves us with the why. Why would he want to do that? And I think it's again pretty simple. Saul knows what the scholars of Ohara found out. He knows about the ancient kingdom and some of the true history, and we do know he's against the world government at this point completely. So with all of these pieces put together, it does make a lot of sense that he was actually trying to prepare the world for that time when the right person would arrive to take down the world government and kind of, you know, make disclosure a little bit easier if you wanted to go with UFO terms, I guess. And his best way to do that was by spreading this guidebook to the Grand Line all around the world. And maybe he was even hoping that Robin would at some point read it, but in the end, a copy of it is traveling with the Straw Hats right now and might be helping them in some small or even big way to finally reach all of their goals. For all that we know, it could have even simply been an inspiration to people who read about the explorers' adventures and then wanted to become adventurers themselves. But what's maybe even crazier is the fact that most of the world at this point thinks that this book is just completely made up. It's even called Bragman, like man who brag or lie, so I wouldn't be surprised at all to learn that the world government has actually spread rumors that this book is just made up stories, since that is one of their main methods of hiding information, just like they hid the fact that Luffy is really a good guy by making up stories about him as well. Again, just like Noland's king called him a liar as well. What you may not realize at this point though is that we may actually know of one other author whose writing is included in Bragman as well. And this isn't officially confirmed at all, but similar to how Arnott's quotes always show up in the narrative boxes, we have had one other named character whose writing has appeared in a similar way. This has actually happened in chapter 218 when the Straw Hats had just left Alabasta and were headed towards Jaya. And as you can see, with the massive ship once again literally falling from the sky, we get a quote from a physicist called Willie Gallen or Willie Karen that says, "Anything that man can imagine is a possibility in reality." Which first of all is just an absolute banger quote, by the way, if you ask me. Like, first off, it kind of reminds me of Vegapunk's comments about devil fruits being, you know, people's dreams and stuff, and also perfectly ties into Luffy's meeting with Blackbeard later in the very same arc. But again, I wonder if Gallen was also an explorer whose writing are in Bragman as well based on that evidence. I mean, it is literally one of the only 2 times in the entire story where we get a random quote from a random character in the One Piece world, so it does make a lot of sense to me that they have similar origins. Plus, if you know much about the real world history, it's not that uncommon for real world scientists from past centuries to also have been explorers and writers, so I'd say there's a pretty decent chance that Willie Gallen was also one of our Bragmen. And we might actually have yet another clue about the Bragman just a few chapters later, because in chapter 222, we get a description of Mocktown in Jaya, again from some mysterious source. It appears to be from the logbook of a ship called the Jewel Wall, which we know, again, absolutely nothing about, but given that it shows up pretty close to the Willie Gallen quote, it wouldn't be too surprised if the Jewel Wall was actually the Bragman's ship, or, you know, at least something like that. And since we're really going off the walls here a little bit, I think it's even reasonable to speculate that all of the narrator boxes that describe islands that the Straw Hats have visited come from the Bragman book as well. I mean, again, this is just a theory, but it would be a really cool tie-in to all of the different places that we've been to, and again, tie into Oda's quote that we're gonna experience Bragman through the eyes of the Straw Hats' journey. He might have done that all along. So let's bring all of this back now to the whole purpose of this video, because we've talked about different explorers from different centuries like Noland, the mysterious group who might have found Emeth, the scholars of Ohara, as well as Louis Arnott and the Bragman. And you probably haven't forgotten that at the start of this video, I was speculating that there is actually a secret society of explorers, these so-called Bragman maybe, who have been silently preparing the world for the time when Joy Boy would return and bring freedom to everyone. everyone. And I still believe that all these explorers have been reuniting the world, advancing science and technology, reconnecting kingdoms that might have once been friends. Now, whether there is actually a sort of official group of these explorers that have been passing on knowledge actively, you know, like they have monthly meetings on a deserted island or something, or at least pass it on to the next generation, we probably won't ever really know for sure, at least for a while. But if you kind of read between the lines here and connect the pieces, I definitely do think that there's a really good chance that they have been there throughout the centuries from the Void Century, working in the background quietly until Joy Boy can finally return. I mean, even look at what Joy Boy himself said here in the few panels that we've ever had of him so far. He knew that there would be more battles in the future, and since we do know that the D clan survived, it just makes too much sense, I think, that there have been people preparing for Joy Boy's return throughout the centuries. And it starts with exploration and connection and friendship. Everything that the Strahds have accomplished has been set up with the help of the explorers who have come before them, and I think it ties in very nicely with Vegapunk's quote that the War of the Void Century never actually ended. But also, speaking of setting up for a long time, there is another event that Oda has been also preparing the One Piece world for ever since the days of Nolan was alive 400 years ago, and it's not Joy Boy's return or even finding the One Piece. Instead, I'm talking about the greatest sword duel that will ever exist in the One Piece world, Zoro versus Mihawk for the title of World's Strongest. And if you want to see exactly how Oda has been setting up this thing for over 1,000 chapters and over 400 years of One Piece history, you can watch that video right below me. Otherwise, as always, thanks so much for watching, and thanks also again to Cyberghost VPN for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check the link in the description below to get a special discount for Cyberghost VPN to protect your data while you browse and gain full access to all blog content on the internet for $2.03 a month. Totally risk-free, so check it out, and I will see you in the next one.